now first ask my committee members to reflect on the conference discussions and the data for policy in general for 5 minutes each. Then we will continue with question and answers. Helen?
Thank you. So these are my reflections from, I've only been here today, so excuse me if they're sort of biased in some way, if there's algorithmic bias in that, and let me know. As I mentioned, I have been looking at what we're now calling GovTech for a long time, but not as long as it's been around, because when you think about it, when computers first entered government in the UK and the US, it was really the 1950s, something like that. And although I've heard lots of people sort of say, oh, algorithms, you know, algorithms are not just code, you know, there's other sorts of algorithms. That's true, but at the same time, I think it's also true that all code is algorithms. I mean, basically, that's what code is, computer code. And in that sense, algorithmic government or some aspiration towards algorithmic government has been around for a very long time. And what we used to say about it in the very early days, particularly before the internet came along and made it a bit more kind of sexy, was that somehow computers, algorithms, would out-Weber, as my colleague and formerly PhD supervisor Christopher Hood rather brilliantly put it, that it would make government more rational, would make bureaucracy more rational, kind of rationalization more rational, more efficient. And that would be for the good, that government would be better insofar as bureaucracy was a very efficient way to do things. And also we'd get more of all the things that Weber feared when he talked about a sort of gloomy bureaucratic world where officials, the sort of gloomy bureaucratic world of officialdom. Now that didn't happen. It didn't happen in all the days when we talked about e-government and digital government and information technology. All those years, it didn't happen. I don't think government really did become more rational in any sense that I can really think of. Why not? Because it's difficult. It's difficult building large-scale systems. It also didn't happen because policymakers, officials were perhaps kind of scared of technology. They didn't understand it. They thought it wouldn't make a difference. They thought it wouldn't make a difference, that it didn't really matter, that it was something kind of policy neutral, that it wasn't policy critical, and that it was never going to be the core competency of government, so we could just outsource it. And in some countries, particularly the UK, that's really what happened. You know, large-scale computer systems are basically outsourced. And so one of the things I think I've learned today is that data and data science seem to be different. There seems to be, I know this is a self-selected audience, but I've noticed this across government and right at the very top at government, that policymakers from the very top are interested in the possibilities of data and data science. There seems to be, you know, more of a buzz about it. Perhaps it sounds more like the sort of thing, large-scale data sounds more like the sort of thing government ought to be doing, perhaps. People seem to get the importance of it, and that's exciting. I still don't see, and as I said before, I think a key difference between this conference and one that took place, that would have taken place 20 years ago, is that there wouldn't have been anybody here, i.e. it wouldn't have happened. Certainly not right at the end. Everyone would have drifted off by now. But I still don't see kind of, I don't observe from today kind of a massive injection of rationalization, though, rationalization through data. I don't observe that. So I think that three observations. I'll end with three observations with that. Firstly, I think governments are still held back by the digital government infrastructure or lack thereof. Still difficult to do that. And when you think about it, that's what delivers the data. That's what's going to deliver real-time transactional data. So if we don't get the digital government bit right, if that's still a struggle, that we get it. And I don't think we really know why. That came out of the discussion after Philip's lecture. I know we're awfully inclined, particularly in the UK, to blame size, for example. Can we really go on doing that? Facebook has 1.6 billion users, and it's not constantly crashing and going down. I don't think we really know, but I do think that that's a challenge for the future of kind of data and algorithms for policy. I've observed lots of sort of discussions of things which are not kind of particularly rational, that I think are going to go on being a challenge. I've heard about models that work but we don't know why, or models that don't work. I've heard about unexpected results of the operationalization of luck. I've heard about regulatory decay, and I think this is a real challenge for kind of government by algorithm, that we are seeing, government really facing a kind of automatic regulatory decay, if you like. I've heard about bounded rationality and an explosion of algorithmic errors. All these things sound like kind of almost the opposite of what we think government's supposed to be good at. So that's going to be a challenge. It sounds almost like government could get less robust, less resilient, less efficient, less transparent, less fair. All those things, that's something that government's got to cope with. And finally, I've heard some really exciting, and I'm sure there have been lots of others that I've missed because I've not been able to be in two places at once, but some really exciting kind of gains from data, from things that are really surprising, like, predictive risk in child welfare, for example, understanding gang warfare. Those weren't the things I expected to hear about when I came. And they sound to me like things that were sort of conducted and done in the spirit of innovation with data rather than perhaps rationalization. And we've got to all carry on looking for those things, keep looking for the exciting ways that do seem to be there to make government better. As everyone knows, I'm not an experienced moderator of sessions. I organize conferences, but I don't moderate sessions. So I've forgotten to introduce my plenary speakers, so I'll ask them to kindly do that themselves as they go. I'm Helen Margetts. I'm Professor of Society and Internet at the University of Oxford, and I'm Director of the Oxford Internet Institute, which is a multidisciplinary department at the university.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Barbara Ubaldi, and I'm heading the unit at the OECD responsible for digital government, open data, and what we call data-driven public sector. That's why I start by saying that if I compare this conference last year, so I don't go back of 30 years, but I go back of 12 months. And this year, what I really like a lot is the fact that this year there are many more examples coming from the practitioners, meaning the people who are actually working within public sectors. Because that was one of the comments I had at the end of the conference last year, which was how can we bring together more different actors of the ecosystem, because if we are looking at the use of data for policy, we need to have the policymakers and we need to have the civil servants who are actually supposed to use the data and to put in practice ideas that maybe researchers are thinking about. And so that's a positive comment I want to start with, because I think that kind of interaction and collaboration and exchange is growing even within this forum. So I think that's really a nice evolution on which we need to build in the years to come. Why is this important? Because here come my observations, which build on things I've heard in the past 2 days. So you probably will recognize things I'm saying in things that you have said. I think it's very important to focus on the implementation, meaning I think if we are, especially all of us who are here, believe in the potential of having data-driven policymaking. Let's use this general term to cover all that we've been discussing here in these couple of days. If that's true, we need to focus on how to make this happen and not only just to build the momentum for believing in it. And in that sense, one point that came up, and there might be an area on which we can focus our efforts, is the skills and the environment within the public sector to be able to have a higher number of people practicing what we're discussing about. And one of you yesterday said something very interesting: until when the data analyst or the data scientist is seen as somebody who's an external intrusion in a normal team of civil servants, things will not change. It's important to start thinking about a team with a set of different skills and capabilities, which include also data analysis as a core competence maybe of civil servants who are supposed not to work as data analysts, but they are supposed as being policy, as being civil servants addressing some policy issues, for instance. This comes with the second point I want to make, which is the cultural shift. So I don't think it's about technology, the discussion here, but as many of you have said, how can we create an environment where the way of working can actually keep being an innovative way of working? So I'm not going to go in details in that sense, but I think it's important to think about not only the recognition of the importance of upgrading the use of emerging technologies and data, but also how to make sure that actually those who have to take the decisions to make sure that civil servants feel free to work in these innovative ways can actually do it. Transparency and ethics came up quite frequently in many discussions. So how can we make sure that if we increase the use of algorithm and related techniques, we are transparent on how we do it, and we are capable of being accountable and being up to responding to the ethical related questions that might come from the public, because the wrong conclusions that the application of an algorithm can bring to when the algorithm is applied in the private sector can be detrimental for a company because they can lead to loss of profit, but the negative results that could happen if the wrong algorithm is applied by a public sector entity, the consequences can really be much worse than lost profit. So we need to take that into account. And that's very important from a legal perspective because laws and regulations are seen as an obstacle, but there was a very interesting intervention this morning on how actually we can maybe design laws that in a way can help us advance the data-driven policy making. And actually, I was referring to the case of Denmark, for instance, where the approach to lawmaking, it's actually changing. So a capacity building is put in place for the regulators to make sure that the moment the law is designed, regulators have in mind what can be the impact down the road from a digital perspective of any law, passing the message that a bad law will be translated in a bad code. So I think it's also a necessity to discuss about various elements together. And then to conclude, I think monitoring came up not too much, but came up as an important element. So monitoring the impact and the results of these new approaches. Also to create a critical mass of demand from different parts of the public sector to replicate good examples based on the use of data for improved policy making. So I think this is a way also to make sure that these become sustainable in the long run, and they're not just individual examples here and there, but they become a reality in the years to come across public entities. Thank you.
So my name's Peter Smith. I'm Professor of Social Statistics at the University of Southampton, and I'm also Director of the Administrative Data Research Network for the UK and the English Centre. So you may have seen our stores, but the network has been set up to facilitate access to government administrative data for policy benefiting research. And I think why I wanted to introduce I'm a social statistician as well, so perhaps you should take my comments as a statistician who's been working with social and official data for 20 years. One of the things I've heard, I think it's been an excellent conference, and one of the things that I judge a conference by is how difficult it is to decide which of the parallel sessions to go to. And so every single parallel session I've had to debate which ones to go to. So thank you very much for the organisers of the programme. I think in most talks I've gone to, the word transparency has come up. And I started reflecting, I'm not sure we even know what we mean by transparency. And if taking the one extreme, I think people are going to think transparency is simplifying. And the other extreme is just making open in a complex way what we've done. And I'm not totally convinced that transparency is the right word, because other people mentioned trust. And I think it's much more about trust. We do things all the time. We use our phones, we drive our cars. We don't probably understand how they work. We trust they will work. So I think if we're not careful by saying we're going to be transparent, we're going to be challenged too much to be to provide things and then people say, oh, you're doing too complicated things. So I think that was one thing that seemed to come up, and some people did actually say that you've got to be careful about transparency. Another thing was, I was at that meeting where we debated about the question mark. at the beginning of the title. And so now in reflection, I was wondering what, if I was sitting in that committee, again, trying to decide the title of this conference, what would I now write, having heard what I've heard over the last 2 days? And I think I would call it Government Aided by Algorithms. And it relates to this question that I've seen flashing up a number of times. Who is accountable for when algorithms go wrong? And no matter what we decide, somebody, a human, has to make a decision. And it's at what stage? If the human may decide that they're going to let the algorithm decide, but somebody has made that decision. So in my mind, there is going to be a human accountable. What we've done to bring together, I want to try and categorize people, sort of the policymakers and the algorithmic developers, and it's excellent, and there's been a lot of exchange, but I still think that this is interdisciplinary research, and we've got to reflect on the challenges of interdisciplinary research. And I still see, coming from the social science side, having worked with official statisticians, government statisticians, that there still needs to be some understanding of the way government works. Where people are developing the algorithms that are solving problems, there needs to be some thought about, and it came up in this morning's discussion about there are some things that maybe we can do in the commercial sector that are no-go in the government. And by working and understanding what those constraints are, I think we might be able to work together better. There was a couple of things. I was disappointed, I guess, to hear that uncertainty in decisions was not mentioned as often as I would have liked it to have. So some sort of measures of uncertainty when a decision is being made. And there were some good examples, but I feel that if we're going to use algorithms to make decisions, we need the algorithm also needs to produce a confidence in its recommendation. And maybe then we're doing it in classifiers when we're using it to do certain things where we say, well, the algorithm is this % certain, let it do it, but at this stage we do need some human intervention. And I think some of the mistakes that have gone on in the past might not have happened if there was some human intervention in the process. My final thing, I think it's been alluded to, but there seems to be, there's been little mention of what we might call Bayesian methods in their true sense of combining expert opinion with data. So I think one thing that people might want to investigate further is the Bayesian paradigm provides a way of combining expert opinion with data in a coherent manner. And I was, again, another word I didn't hear as much, and I think they go hand in hand, is uncertainty and Bayesian methods. So let's just stop there.
Great. So I'm Stephan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of GovLab at NYU. And I'm going to try not to repeat what I said yesterday during the keynote, which I still obviously think might be also still relevant, especially as we think about that we need more data about how to use data, which I think resonated throughout the conference as well. But I think I'm going to pick up where Peter left and actually go a step back and say, why are we here? I mean, why do we care, right? And from my point of view, I mean, why I work on this is because I do believe that we can improve people's lives by improving the way we govern. That's basically, anyway, an assumption. And of course, the question is that a correct assumption? But anyway, assume that the assumption is correct. Then the question is, what do we mean by improving governance? And from my point of view, improving governance basically means making governance more legitimate and more effective. And I do believe that those two elements are fundamental elements that we should measure whether we actually make government more legitimate and more effective, because the assumption is that a legitimate and effective government or governance improves people's lives. Now, the challenge is, as we all know, that becoming more legitimate quite often makes you more effective. And making you more effective quite often makes you more legitimate. Legitimate in the sense of less transparent, less participatory, less accountable, or less representative depending on what kind of legitimacy we are talking about. And so the real question that I always struggle with is, if we work on new methods, in this case data, to make government more legitimate and effective, are we achieving both end goals? Meaning, are we achieving a more legitimate and more effective government? And the challenge is that with data, it quite often achieves one, but it doesn't achieve the other one. And that's the real challenge, is that, and that was part, I guess, of the discussion that we had this morning as well. Do we want to have a government that uses tools that has become very effective, but then ultimately ignores the legitimacy of using the tool or the legitimacy of governance itself? And so the real challenge from my point of view is to figure out, right, and this is, by the way, not new. I mean, we mentioned GovTech. I've also been in the GovTech realm for quite a while. And in the past, when we talked about GovTech, you had eGov quite often, and that really focused on the effectiveness. And then you had the other stream, and they never talked quite often to each other. You had the other stream, which was about deliberative democracy, and they focused on the legitimacy part, but then ignored the effectiveness part. And my assumption was that in 2017, we can actually use technology perhaps to achieve both legitimacy and effectiveness. And today, or the last 2 days, it seems to me that we are, with data, not there yet, because we ignore the other element that is happening, which is the innovations in citizens' engagement. And from my point of view, I think if we can have data plus citizens' engagement and the innovation that happens there, then we might actually end up in a more legitimate and effective governance. And in the past, I've also said is that, and that reflects to what you mentioned, is that AI is great, but if you combine it with CI, i.e. collective intelligence, then it makes it better. And from my point of view, AI without CI is not gonna work towards becoming also legitimate. CI, like Wikipedia for instance, without AI is never gonna be able to scale. And so the interesting thing is going to be, where do we actually have data and people meet in a manner to make government better, i.e. more legitimate and effective? And I think that's, anyway, it was, in some cases you could clearly see that, but I think we have to really start thinking and using those metrics more to evaluate how we're doing.
Okay, so I'm John Crowcroft. I'm a professor of communication systems in the University of Cambridge. I was going to say computer lab, but we just changed our name. We finally succumbed to being yet another computer science department after 75 years. But I also work half-time in the Turing Institute for Data Science in London. So I'm going to talk about three things. One is Terry Pratchett. So Terry Pratchett sadly died recently as a very humorous British author who wrote some satirical novels, and I really recommend people read them. If you may feel you're a bit not young enough to read them, but you'll never, that's the wrong attitude. And one I recently reread is called The Truth, and it's about, in a sort of fantasy planet, the introduction of print presses for newspapers. And this has been resisted for thousands of years by religion because too many people read too many new things in the news. Another one is called Going Postal, which is about the introduction of a postal service, and there's another one called Making Money, which is about the introduction of money. And they're very, very funny books, and I just recommend you all go off and read them. And of course, the fear of books is, a very ancient thing, and so because too many people have that knowledge and therefore power, potentially, and might question things. And of course, the point just made about the engagement process is sort of exactly that. If we have legitimate government in the face of data and available data and transparency would actually evaporate. It should cease to exist. It should not be necessary. It's not just about the algorithms, it's about the collective intelligence interacting with the data directly. And the policy level of government would effectively be direct. So it's a known thing, direct democracy, liquid democracy. There have been experiments. Big problem is that, as was just alluded to here perfectly, is that we don't have scalable technologies for collective intelligence yet. Wikipedia scales pretty well for an encyclopedia, actually, but people have tried building systems that use the kind of edit war control features of Wikipedia in liquid democracy systems, and they're small experiments at the moment. So So I think that's an important observation, and we really want to think about that, particularly this year of this conference. I think that's a really good thing where we could be thinking about more experiments, which might include, to sort of going on to my second point in a bit, might include kind of random trials of different things to see what happens, so people would have data to see how you might try different education, healthcare, policing, whatever, doing things scientifically. The second point is I just sort of walking around, hearing the talks, looking at demos and so on, I noticed a significant fraction are not really about algorithms for government. They're actually more about operational use of data. So they didn't get to the policy level. There were implicit policy decisions. In particular, I think some of the Essex demo stuff was really neatly linked together because they were linking things across different domains that a local county council and police and so on would use, and that's got an implicit decision to do something, but the actual things being done, are great, but they're not really going up to the policy. They're not adding algorithms to people to do policy changes, for example, that might be interesting yet. This sort of kind of leads partly to my third point, which I brought up when I was asking a question of a keynote yesterday, I think, which is kind of about the difference between the age groups in level of skill, ability, and knowledge about the data-driven world. And this really is a problem at the policy level, and it's a problem at the collective intelligence level. So it's sort of the opposite way around. A lot of young people get what data is about and what algorithms do. It's absorbed. It's got, osmosis kind of works. Eventually, you get enough examples you acquire. Even if you didn't study algorithms at school or statistics, you get a feel for it. So that means the younger portion of the people who would like to make direct decisions about things when presented data will be able to, but a large fraction of the older part of the population will not be able to. This is pretty obvious when you look at the result of the referendum in the UK, when you look at the age distribution of the vote. The inability to deal with evidence was very clearly poorly distributed over differentiated by the level of education and age. That's just fact. You can go look up the data if you like. And the evidence for the decision made was non-factual. So that's a practical issue. But it gets worse when you get into government in the UK. This is much less of a problem across other parts of the EU. My shirt is a political statement. That you will find many people in France and Germany in government who have scientific training. It's not funny for somebody to go into politics. It's pretty rare here. I think the last person with a PhD in a government, with a scientific PhD, was Julian Huppert from Cambridge, who didn't get through again, being a Lib Dem, he got tarred with, but whatever. And it's quite rare. You find a few, I think, Liberal MPs who are doctors and get it, but there are very few others. Whereas in France and Germany, you find many. It's quite common. So when you want to have a civil servant who's operationalized some machine learning algorithms over some data, talk to a policymaker who might then explain to the collective intelligence of the public why this policy would do this versus this one would do this, they won't get it. In particular, many of our senior politicians at the policy level have training in philosophy, politics and economics, or law, and these are completely inadequate for explaining anything to the public. And I'm going to give you a concrete example of this. There's a couple of years ago, there was an analysis of the terms and conditions published by all the cloud service providers and compared them in length of document with Shakespeare plays. So the Twitter terms and conditions are longer than King Lear as a play, and they are legalese, which means the chances of a lawyer understanding them, let alone explaining them to another lawyer or judge or a member of the public, are zero. Now let's look at all the other sectors which we have to explain things to. Well, somebody has to explain things to the public, and this is already a problem with data and services based on data in the commercial industry cloud sector, right? We have to worry about privacy. People don't understand privacy. We have to worry about in healthcare about risk. What are the consequences of choosing different operations when you go for something? And it's explaining risk is fabulously difficult to the public. So somebody from statistics background, no problem. But the average, what we call the person on the top of the Clapham omnibus, sorry, it's a very English London allusion, but means a sort of typical, go out, not in a street out here, because they're not typical, but Clapham's sort of typical area, and pick a person and say, what does a standard deviation mean? What are your confidence limits on that graph you just drew about how the economy is going to go? Anything like that, you'll get very, very blank stares. And there's a whole list of these. And so my challenge, when people have been coming up with challenges, my challenge is how do we deal with the education problem for the people in the policy level, the senior people in the policy level who tend to be older people, and we should start, last year, 10 years ago, probably somehow. One way to do that might be to take people from the scientific, mathematical, machine learning, algorithm background, say, hey, why don't you become a senior politician? Wouldn't that be cool? There are scientific advisors, they're great, but they give their advice, and then a friend of mine was scientific advisor to transport, a professor of statistics from Cambridge, Frank Kelly, and he gave some fantastic advice about how to publish metrics for how much you'd improve the road service and the recovery from broken vehicles. And the minister said, oh, we couldn't possibly use that, because if we succeeded, the public would say we spent too much money, and if we failed, they'd understand that we'd failed. And why? And so this is a classic British problem, right? So how do we break that? That would be an interesting thing. But also on the other side, for this collective intelligence, I completely agree with that point, but to enable that, to be fair, whatever that means, another thing that's difficult to explain to people, we need to enable that across the age groups in society, and I think that's quite a difficult challenge. And we have a lot of people here who are in the education business, and we could think about how we could work, with moving things into schools, encouraging schools to move more statistics and programming into schools. The UK's got a very good deal in computing, but it'd be nice if that was embedded with statistics and geographic information system, blah, blah, blah. So how could we do that would be an interesting thing to push on.
Thanks so much. We are recording this session so that I can actually listen to all these suggestions again and reflect on that. Is that working now? Okay, sorry. Okay, just I want to say one thing to Peter's comment about the Bayesian approaches, a Bayesian paradigm. Basically, it's actually the whole inspiration behind the Data for Policy conference, I have to say. It's really, I am a believer of Bayesian paradigm as a whole, and how it deals with uncertainty and incomplete information, and how logically you can connect different pieces of evidence in a coherent way. So that's one of the main inspirations, as I said. But I agree that we don't get so many in the discussion so far. I hope it will be more. And the next thing...
Respond? Maybe it's just given now that people are using Bayesian methods, and we're not saying they're Bayesian methods. So
maybe,
again,
yes.
maybe it's just...
Exactly. So the first question that I want to open with is actually the first question. Again, Peter has already mentioned the question of who will be held accountable if algorithm goes wrong. So, John, do you want to, who would like to basically?
So it's a domain-specific answer. There isn't a generic answer. There's a, I think I was just talking to somebody yesterday, there's a call for evidence to House of Lords, yeah, Committee on Science and Technology for AI, and one of the areas that we gave some feedback on was exactly this. And liable, you want to have some liability. Well, it completely depends. That's what a lawyer would say anyway. I'm sure people with more legal expertise here will hopefully agree. But in the extreme case of the data used to train self-driving cars being erroneous and having no capability of dealing with adversarial images, it's not completely clear what would happen. It depends what the insurance people have decided what the level of acceptable risk is in that area. And in the same way that wear and tear on some component in an airplane might lead to the occasional crash, and what's the acceptable level would just be something that will be worked on. In another area, if some agency along the line in the production have been clearly negligent in the production of something, which may be a thing we can require of software systems eventually in the next few years, then it would be just like other physical components going wrong. That's a slightly different thing than the training data, and there's an issue of transparency to deal with how you actually can assess that. But you get to a court, it can be done. There have been cases of algorithms going wrong. Radiotherapy device that gave somebody 10,000 times the dose led to a company being in very big legal trouble, and it was a software bug, and they were liable. So I don't see why there's not precedent here for thinking about it. But you have to look in each domain area for what the relevant mechanisms of law and so on are, the assignment of liability and so on. In some cases, in the car case, for example, I think accepted wisdom right now is that the software and the AI and the machine learning, the decisions made inside the car are just part of the car, in the same way your ABS brakes are, your airbags are, and the car, you bought the car, and if something goes wrong with it, it's Ford or whoever's problem, and they can pass that on, of course, but then that creates a chain where they will check the software they get, and they'll do a lot of testing. So there are other cases, where something invades your privacy or does some discriminatory behavior or whatever, and I think you have to just going to look at each case. It's going to take probably about 4 times as long to do all of this as Brexit.
Great, thanks. So anyone?
I agree with John as well, but I'm always quite puzzled by, I've done a lot of work on cybersecurity at a certain point in time, and your question with liability of software is less discussed and was always less clear than now. Suddenly the discussion about who is going to be liable with regard to the algorithm or the artificial intelligence. Meaning, because frankly, why do we have poor cybersecurity is because we actually have low levels of liability. And so perhaps you can take that as a lesson and carry it on to this field and say we actually do have to start thinking more about liability without, of course, undermining, which was mentioned this morning in the keynote as well, without undermining a certain level of risk-taking, because I do feel that, anyway, in order to innovate, you do have to go for certain risk-taking, but again, it has to be in a responsible manner, and there has to be some kind of liability. We also have to prevent immunity. Yesterday we had a discussion about the immunity that platforms have, frankly, as it relates to content, because and you can see that all over again, is that they have, for instance, in the US, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that provides full immunity to the platforms with regard to the content that they carry, and as a result we have the challenges that we have. And there is now a huge, call for liability for the platforms, but that is going to become an ideological battle to a large extent. And so, yes, we need to start thinking about liability. We need to start thinking about preventing immunity or preventing the cybersecurity kind of sphere. But it's going to be, a lot of it is going to be about due process, because it's going to be about, you never will have 100% secure. You're never going to have 100% non-discriminatory kind of algorithms, but what is the process that you have to go through to assure that you actually had good care with regard to developing and designing certain kinds of things? And I think that's going to be an important design question. Thanks.
Anyone else would like to comment on that? We've done already, but Barbara, Helen, maybe.
I'm not sure I want to add much. I mean, in the decision-making framework, people have been making decisions for a long time, and we have decision makers who are meant to take the responsibility. And I see the algorithms as aiding decisions. And so I think there was a discussion earlier, but I think a lot of law will already cover that. Somebody has to make a decision.
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I mean, I agree with John. Well, and I agree with everyone. But the point is that if it's government taking the liability, then it kind of emphasises the point about John's sort of education point about understanding what it means to take a decision in that way. And I would just add to what John said about the kind of need for education and stress that I think that goes both ways. I mean, yes, people, policymakers, people who work in government, social scientists have got to understand code, algorithms, and data and data analysis, but also scientists need to understand government and human behaviour and all the things that social scientists understand. And that, I think that we do have a bit of a tendency to kind of train all our scientists and our computer scientists and our scientists as if they're going to go off and be astrophysicists or something. The most likely thing is that they're going to go to Facebook or Google and do social science, basically, without any training in it.
Just super quickly to say that, to build on what Stefan was saying, that I think that's very much linked to the idea of transparency. What kind of transparency? The education, the capacity to explain which algorithm is being used. So I think it goes back to the idea of trust. So also to get back to what you were saying about transparency earlier, I think transparency intended in that sense.
Okay, thank you very much. So at this point, I would like to also open it for the questions from the room as well. So if anyone would like to make comments or ask anything, please raise hands. Emmanuel?
A comment triggered by the comment made on data literacy by many of you. In the previous keynote today, we heard that blockchain technologies, distributed ledger technologies can help in all sorts of different applications. And I wonder, what is your view in terms of deploying these technologies also for quality assurance? Because when we think about certification of data, quality of algorithms, we tend to think naturally in a hierarchical, traditional way, but maybe some more decentralized quality assurance mechanism with peer-to-peer could work. And this is already emerging, for example, in the communication domain with wiki platforms and quasi-blockchain technologies deployed to check real facts from fake news.
Would anyone like to respond?
I think that's a very interesting question. Traditionally, I mean, this morning when we talked about blockchain, it basically focused on two elements. One was the identity and the other one was the smart contracting. But basically there is a third strong value proposition behind blockchain, which sometimes is even stronger than the other two, which is the possibility to track and trace as a result of blockchain. And so exactly using blockchain to track and trace sources and to then ultimately have that in some kind of a immutable fashion, I think has its attractions and could actually help with some of the challenges with regard to trust in sourcing. So yeah, so I think, again, have we done enough experimentation? No, but the value proposition is there, and I think it's worth pursuing.
So there's a couple of examples of that I think worth just remembering. One is, there's a good and a bad one. There's a proposal for a blockchain type system called RSCoin from George Denises at UCL, which is very, very cool. And I think it's moved on quite a long way. We've done with the Bank of England, which includes the ability to be explicitly named as the endpoint. And if any one endpoint names everyone along the chain names, it also includes the ability to have a transaction carried with the transactions down the chain, which could include VAT, which is brilliant because then you have a very inexpensive way of collecting tax and doing things legitimately and transparently, which is all good. But you can choose not to. You can choose to be in a cash economy. It's a choice. But clearly, large trading organizations, supermarkets, whatever, would do this, and it would make their job easier and tax collection easier and so on. And it's all fine. On the downside, actually, this was a suggestion. I believe it got dropped, but the DWP, Department for Work and Pensions in the UK, thought about emulating the food stamps in the US, but using a blockchain currency, so they could tell that you weren't spending your money for your welfare on alcohol and gambling, or even prevent you from doing this. It was an interesting failure of imagination. Also failed to spot that any currency is fungible, and therefore you can turn blockchain currency into something for somebody else who buys you the alcohol, does the gambling, in the same way food stamps were used that way. So it was a completely pointless idea, except for that it might make it a bit cheaper than issuing paper checks, which the British government still bizarrely does, but that's a minor problem. So yeah.
Okay, great. So we can, I think, take a few questions at once if there are, if everyone can raise hands if they want to have. If not, then in that case, I will go back to our Slido questions and favor for the one with a name. So the question is, accurate information is not value neutral and can both help and hurt populations. What are the ethical obligations of statisticians as service providers? So it's the one at the top. You have it in the screen as well. It's the top question. So I'm going to read it again. Accurate information is not value neutral and can both help and hurt populations. What are the ethical obligations of statisticians as service providers?
I'm gonna only, and then anyway, others with brighter ideas should step in. But I'm gonna only deal with the first question. I'm not gonna deal or the first part. And exactly, I mean, there was a whole discussion about to what extent are algorithms value driven, and obviously algorithms are value driven because the ones that are developing the values developing the algorithms have values, and as a result they are value driven. There is no such thing as non-value driven kind of tools. And how traditionally we have dealt with those kinds of challenges in, for instance, the mediation space was that because you have those different values, you actually want to have a certain level of plurality, so that you can basically say, well, I would actually, anyway, adhere more to those values, and then, anyway, would follow those kinds of mediation. And the question I always posed, and perhaps that's for another topic for the conference, is can we have algorithmic plurality, or algorithmic pluralism, in which you basically have an assumption that indeed you have different algorithms and there are different values embedded in those algorithms, but because it's plural, you can actually have a level of choice which algorithm you want to abide to, or which algorithm you prefer to have your recommendations made, for instance. And so, so that would be one topic that I think this audience, with its huge brain power, I would love to have more reflection about, because that could actually deal with this kind of element that you would never prevent values, but you do want to have a certain plurality of values being represented. Does that require some kind of algorithmic pluralism?
So we have a statistician on the panel.
Just take evidence, take against that statement. In some senses, accurate information can't hurt anybody. It's what people decide to do with that information. So and that's a policy decision. Yeah. And again, lots of policy decisions help certain parts of the population and are detrimental to other parts, and that is part of the decision process. So I would take issue accurate. We all want, does anybody not want accurate information? It seems to suggest that we might not want accurate information, so more information is good information. All accurate information is important. It's the policymakers that are making the decisions about who may benefit and not.
Well, I suppose, I don't know, giving the question the benefit of the doubt, I suppose if you were to mean, if an algorithm can predict with such accuracy that they can say, for example, that a child is definitely going to drop out of school, that would be accurate information that you might decide not to want. Because, I mean, you might not, but what do you do with that information? Do you put more resources into that child or less resources into that child? Or do you pretend you don't know? What's the ethical thing to do? And I think that's a really difficult dilemma which we're used to encountering in the health field, but we're not so used to encountering in the policy world more generally. And I think, you know, that is something we have to confront perhaps. You know, do we want to know that?
Sorry, very quickly, and again, I also don't answer about the second part of the question, but I think this question very much relates to the use of the information or data that is being done, and it goes back to the old discussion on the algorithm and the capacity to explain what kind of algorithm is being used and the values behind it, which in some cases might be biased. And I think, you know, the risk of like biased decisions can be higher in certain policy areas than in others. And I think, you know, there was a recent podcast I was listening to that was discussing the meaning of accurate. How do we define to the audience that whatever kind of value or result is accurate, you know? So I really think it's about being capable to explain, and there's a whole community, which is the open data community, that would say that that's why they want the data. They don't want even policymakers to actually use the data to come to conclusions, but they want the raw data. They even scream if you talk about information. So just to say that that's part of the story.
So there are very specific instances of people wishing information to be inaccurate, or at least to be less precise, for privacy reasons. And the requirement, for example, I could give several examples, but location tracking for crowd control or managing traffic, smart meters are completely unnecessarily accurate. We need aggregate information at city block consumption level, histogram bin of maybe 10 values of a busy hour or highest demand for electricity on a block by block basis. You don't need to know when somebody opened a fridge door per house. The person in the house might want it, but it doesn't have to leave the house, and it doesn't have to be remembered for more than a minute or an hour a day. And so I think there are examples, but they're not really policy examples. But the problem is that there are civil servants who said, oh yeah, but if we had that, then we could nudge behavior, or it used to be. I think nudging has gone out of fashion. So there's a bit of mission creep. Because we can get with data, we can put it all somewhere, we could do something, and it's like, well, you might think that. We actually, do we really need to? There is also, it's not free. It costs a lot of energy to move all that data somewhere and to centrally process it. And the smart metering example is an incredibly bad piece of design. It's an incredible waste of money for very little gain to the electricity generator and grid, given they're going to have to rebuild the whole thing when we have microgeneration and smart cars charging all around the place. It's going to be completely changed anyway. So I think there are kind of some cases, but I don't think they're the things that go to the policy level. So I don't want to get into a big argument about that. I just think they're rather narrow special reasons.
But I guess it depends what you mean by accurate.
Right, exactly.
Unprecise and various things. So to have highly aggregated data, I would still say that can be accurate if it's measuring what it's meant to be measured.
I think that's exactly, the thing that the generator and grid companies wanted was an accurate model. They didn't want so they could change the pattern of pricing and whatever if that would affect things. And they didn't need precision, fine grain, I guess is the right word. So I think I totally agree. Yeah.
Okay, so gentlemen.
Look, yeah. I'd like to pick up on that comment by Stefan about plurality of algorithms, because I feel there's been implicit throughout the last couple of days, at least in the sessions I've been in the keynotes, when we talk about GovTech, we're talking very much about single nation states. We haven't really discussed much what happens between countries. If you have algorithms start interacting between countries, competing, possibly fighting. So I'm curious what thoughts the panel has on that.
All right, so would anyone want to reflect that?
Yeah, no, I'm gonna have to think more about your question, but but again, I'm never shy of answering anyhow. But well, it's interesting that in the last few days we've had Putin coming out and saying that the one who's gonna have the edge on artificial intelligence is gonna be able to control the world. You had Elon Musk making similar kinds of remarks, and you have others as well that are now seeing AI as the battlefield for gaining a competitive edge. I know this is not your question, but I think it's going to become interesting. I mean, yesterday I spoke about we need to have a better understanding of the political economy of the data ecosystem, but we also have to have a better understanding of the geopolitical economy of all this work, because it's going to exactly become quite often an area where there's going to be competition among nation states. In certain kinds of fields, and I think we just have to be realistic that is going to be the case, and I'm going to stop there.
Okay, so great, thanks. Okay, go ahead.
My name is Mahmoud, and I have one comment and maybe one question. The comment is, I feel there is a taken for granted setting for government analytics and policy. It appears to me a little bit, from the region where I come from, it's like the Middle East. I feel it appears like there is like OECD country among themselves learning and developing this, but there are lots of countries, I think they have a blank page in these areas. They will be looking for you, saying these people better get it right, because they will be soon looking for best practices and how to transfer that to their country. also because they may not have 40 years' time due to demographic changes and due to reform changes and pressure, so they have less time. So I just wonder whether there's also somewhat felt responsibility to develop this, not properly, but knowing that other people soon, other countries will be looking and saying, okay, what are the best practices and how can we transfer? So that is one comment where I think, how is this going to be transferred? Will it be like that academics will come to conferences and then take it back home and somewhere hope that policymakers then will listen to them? Or will there be something like an international agency for government analytics and policy? I don't know, that would be the question.
So we have OECD.
Oh yeah. So, and again, yeah, I don't want to dominate it, but so another field of work that we do is around smart cities, which is another nightmare. But guess what? I mean, in that work, I meet with a lot of city officials, and you know what? They are overwhelmed with vendors knocking on their door. And all the vendors know how to make their city smarter. And I think, anyway, your question about where are we going to learn from is the same question I posed this morning in the panel, is that, what is going to be the role of vendors in all of this? Because they are going to see this as the more we are hyped about it, the more they're going to see this as a unique business model to really talk with those countries who not yet are up to speed. And so the question is exactly, is there a role for a non-profit kind of clearinghouse that can help those who might be late in the game or are willing to rethink how they go about it, that can help them not replicate or duplicate, but at least become smarter about how to do this in the best possible manner without having a vendor seeing a great business model in failure quite often. Right? So that's my concern, and I think, anyway, I have no solution to that, but I think that's, I'm sure this is going to happen, and so we need to be prepared for it.
So my question is the following. My answer, sorry, is the following. First of all, even across the OECD family, believe me, there are many governments, there are very few governments that have started working on this in a mature way. Okay, so what you're talking about in terms of a context within OECD countries and non-OECD countries is not even correct, in a sense that even within OECD countries we have very different levels of awareness, interest, and maturity in using these opportunities. And in that sense, I can say that on the contrary, we are working with some non-member countries that are being much more active and entrepreneurial in this sense. These are emerging economies or less advanced economies that are driving the agenda within the OECD on these topics, just to give you a context of what's going on out there. When it comes to then how do we make sure that we transfer the best way of doing this, to be honest with you, the best way we don't know it yet, because there's a lot of experimentation around, but these are not established practices, even across the most advanced countries. What we can do, though, and what we are doing already, we are working with those OECD member countries that are a bit more advanced in using these practices to work together with those that are not that advanced within the OECD and outside, because I work with the 35 OECD member countries, plus now at least 30 more constantly. So we work with about 60 countries around the world to make sure that the OECD countries that have been doing more on this work with others to actually transfer to others their experience on what starts working and mostly what does not work. So we don't even refer to best practice. We refer to knowledge on what they are learning while doing it, but also in trying to understand that it's not about transferring what works in one country to another one, but working together with the country that is interested in learning or doing this to see how that makes sense in the context, specific context of the country. For instance, we've been talking so much about developing the skills, developing the culture within a specific government. I mean, working with the government in the Middle East. We work with a lot of countries in the Middle East. In the Middle East, in Asia, or in Latin America, I'm talking about non-member countries, is very different. So absorbing these practices in contexts that are very different culturally means working with them also to see how to develop the culture, the skills, and the environment within those countries. So this is happening. Like in 10 days, we have the meeting of the people, the CIOs of OECD member countries, plus 20 more, to actually discuss about these things, because our role is a broker of information and exchange of knowledge. So this is happening, but not in a way that we can say we already have a very good database of practices that work extremely well. Like I said in my comment, and then I conclude, there are very good individual examples across countries that are working, so why don't we try to increase the critical mass of these good examples internationally? And that goes back also to the international collaboration that you were talking about, definitely. There's space to actually improve the results nationally if there are efforts also that go towards these collaborative models that Stefan was talking about also in his keynote yesterday.
Well, no, I was reflecting on both those questions and the keynote this morning that said this is going to be like the industrial revolutions. So in some senses, societies have been through transitions. I've worked with a lot of demographic transitions which take place across the world over time. And I was beginning to reflect that maybe this is a place for people, historians who've discovered or investigated the way things are changing and way they're spread out and what is the best practice to disseminate that information. Because we've been, we may conclude that this transition is going to be totally different to other transitions, but we have been through. And so I think I'm becoming a bit like a stuck record, but this is another part of society evolving, and society has evolved. Laws have been adapted as societies evolved. The rules of engagement between nations have evolved as weaponry has improved. So I think we, across the whole scientific scientific history, all the society has information they can use to help us with the next transition.
Well, it was just, I mean, I think your question was really important, and I mean, you already had a really good answer, but I think one area that's particularly important is the area of blockchain technologies, because, and this is also related to your point, I mean, this is perhaps an area where developing countries have more to gain than some of the countries we're talking about. At the same time, where you're going to see competition is companies rushing to sell things which may or may not be blockchain technologies, but they'll certainly have that label on them. And I think that is a big concern going forward. And we do need to help policymakers of all from everywhere to kind of negotiate that world. Because if you do go back to the history of digital government, what you see is kind of massive misbuying and mis-selling of governments of digital technologies. Governments are really, really bad at this. Most governments are really bad at this, and so that that could be a disaster waiting to happen if that market really goes wrong.
I want to go back for a second to the offhand remark about nudging no longer being popular. And I wonder if, leaving that aside, the idea of policymakers moving the behavior of the public through unconscious means and choice architecture and all of that, is there room for us as a data community to nudge the would-be nudgers to get them to take up data and evidence more appropriately in the decision-making that they have, using all of the insights that everyone's learned over the last decade from behavioral economics and psychology? How do we take those insights and apply them to get better data influencing the policy decisions that are being made?
Well, I'm sure John's going to answer, but I mean, yes, I do think that. I mean, I think they are, the behavioural insights team, for example, unless you're from the behavioural insights team, have set up a sort of data operation. But I think what we should be developing is our skills in natural experiments, and understanding that every sort of change that takes place is played out in some data somewhere, if we can get hold of that data, and if we can look at it. So if a platform changes or a policy changes, the chances are there is the data to look at that kind of natural experiment. But I don't think we're terribly good at finding them. I don't think we're prioritizing that enough within data science, and I would like to see that as kind of a core part of data science, sort of looking for causal inference in that way.
Yeah, I would agree that, and again, I'm biased because we're hosting the BIT team US in our offices, so I'm not going to make any statement with regard to behavioral science. But but yeah, I think I agree with you that to a large extent the real value of big data, and the question was already what is big data, but the real value of big data, as we can see within companies, is to be able to experiment. And so what we didn't discuss, I guess through or less discussed throughout the conference, is to what extent does this allow for a more experimental government? And I think that's really one of the big value propositions around big data, is that actually you can anyway have a variety or a series of rapid experimentations. Now, the real challenge again is that we are talking about government, and it's the same thing that I, again, at the end of my talk raised yesterday, is that because it is government and because you're dealing with people's lives, you have a higher standard of due process when you do experiments. If it's about Google and figuring out how to improve the page ranking and doing experiments with different control groups, that's a different proposition than if you really are experimenting with regard to how to allocate scarce resources, for instance, or achieve a certain kind of behavior that is perceived as being the desired behavior without having a public discussion about it.
It goes back to my thing about education. Well, I think what we need to do is develop some facet of the public that is what I might call the GovTech skeptic. So what I mean by that is that when I see a couple of my colleagues are kind of a bit OCD when they're reviewing papers, and they build a quick model of what they think the paper says it does and run it and see if they get the same answer. It's pretty rare, actually. You have to be a bit mad, but it is a good thing to do, and it's kind of reproducible science. You know, can you repeat something or get something similar? But the thing with government is you'd like to say, well, they're proposing this thing, and I would like to do a sanity check as a random member of the public, and I know nothing about health, transport, whatever it is, policy thing they're doing when they're basing it on this data. Can I do what quite a few people in the public can now do, which is the equivalent of doing their tax return in an Excel spreadsheet? Can I do a thing like that? Or actually some reasonable data journalists do. And it doesn't have to be all the public. It has to be enough fraction of the public or a different body that is not the government. So it could be the press. In another country, that might be something you might trust. Right now in this country, I wouldn't. But actually, that's not completely fair. There's some data journalists at The Guardian who do a great job, but unfortunately the editors appear to ignore them. But the thing is, if enough fraction of the public can do that verification, it's the sort of more subtle version. It's the data algorithmic fact-checking. It's not just the fact-checking, it's the consequence of this change based on that data. Is that consequence correct? Would that be what would happen with the uncertainties around that and so on? Oh, does that uncertainty look about the right? You know, does it put things up in the air? Yeah, that sounds about right. Or no, that's complete nonsense. So it's a tech version of, like I say, skepticism and common sense combined. How do we equip enough people in the public to do that, to help them see whether this is, so that would be, and have an appetite to do it. I would tend to just look at one of my Dunbar's number of 150 friends, not the 3,000 on Facebook who are enemies, basically. And if one of them did it, who I know has skill, I go, yeah, okay, great, they've done it, right? So I have friends who go, yeah, I've just got these 17 different light bulbs and tried them all, and these ones do this and those ones do that, and the advertising was right about these. So there are online mechanisms for collective intelligence ways of doing that thing. But I think that's what we need to do. So and in the end, as I said, this would eventually lead to the evaporation of government. Why would you have the government making a decision when a collection of people can look at the evidence, make several decisions, do natural experiments, and then go, oh, look at that. That looks like, we've inferred that is the right thing to do, or the better thing to do with less uncertainty, or whatever we desire.
Okay, so we have got a Trump question that I will ask. Basically, Donald Trump says he wants a centralized federal database of voting records to check everything is in order. How do we prevent abuse of power?
Well, I mean, it's a mistake to say that, I mean, and I don't think many of us are making that assumption, are we, that just because we've got lots of data, it's centralized. I mean, the Estonian, I've heard the Estonian system mentioned many times, and that's actually, I mean, the X-Road system of registries is a very decentralized arrangement of data. So I don't think, I don't think we can blame data for Donald Trump. I mean, you know, I think that's a bit unfair.
I think it's a valid question. I mean, it reminds me of what happened in the data localization debate. I mean, some of you probably are aware that some countries are having some kind of a data nationalistic agenda, i.e. every data set that is being collected within the country should stay in the country, right? And this is the whole data localization debate that has heated up the internet governance field. And the funny part was that Brazil was one of the first ones to announce the data localization strategy, but Brazilian citizens were against it because they didn't trust the Brazilian government to oversee the data that would stay within the country. And so obviously there is a huge issue with regard to trust, and that's where, again, this notion of legitimacy comes into play, i.e. what's the accountability, what is the independent, if we're talking about a democracy, what is the independent oversight of those kinds of practices, and I think it's worth pondering about.
Hi, I'm Alex Jildashova from Carnegie Mellon University, and I primarily work on questions having to do with fairness and transparency and the use of predictive risk modeling in human services and criminal justice applications. Most of my work is based on projects going on in the US where we're confront a different social landscape, and so maybe it's not relevant to here. But some of the observations that have been made in the community in which I usually operate is, for instance, one of the tensions with algorithmic decision-making or even decision support is that it, to the extent that your model is coded up and it's in place, and whenever you put certain inputs through it, it will always produce the same output. That's kind of akin to having a single totalitarian decision maker. That this speaks to the plurality comment earlier, that we are generally more happy with having some random chance of being assigned to a good judge or a bad judge or a good judge for us, at least. And I wonder to what extent that's one of the tensions that you feel on a grander scale. And the other thing I wonder about is the extent to which some of the discomfort that we have has to do with the fact that when you make design choices in an algorithm, this is different from hiring a human assessor, a human expert for the decisions, because you've made explicit design choices. If you're transparent about your design process, you will have had at some point to confront questions of how do you weigh false positives and false negatives, and more in-depth issues than that. And I wonder to what extent having to articulate those choices and having to make them in a way that even if you don't do it explicitly in writing, you can back out what the implied trade-off was that you made, to what extent that's one of the reasons for why we have concerns, that actually we have greater transparency in a sense, and we find ourselves maybe being held to higher standards on account of that and being forced to make explicit some of the choices that are normally just part of due process.
Okay, so we have got 2 minutes to respond to this.
2 minutes each, or?
Yeah. Yes. Yes and yes. But I would recommend, you may want to look at, so I've been working on decision trees in that field for a while, but what I actually was quite pleased by is what Center for Democracy and Technology has done. And so they have developed a digital decision tree, and you may want to check it out, which basically are a set of questions that exactly are being posed during the design of algorithms. And that forces and probes at least some reflection along the way, which I think is a big progress, yeah.
And I think I mean, I think it comes back to the fact that the outputs from these should be a recommendation with some confidence, and so I still get nervous if an algorithm is going to say you must do this, and as soon as it's not going to say you must do this, it's saying I may recommend. It is becoming an automated expert in some way.
Can I
think I've said that at least twice.
I think it's also important not to romanticize what you're comparing it with. I mean, hiring decisions, traditionally, when done by humans, have been a decision to hire a white man, you know, looking at it crudely. And if you think of what a bureaucracy is, if you look at it's a sort of Weber's vision for bureaucracy, I mean, it was something that looked a bit like in his mind, it was something that looked like a combustion engine, you know, where everybody in it was faceless and didn't have any individuality and were just a sort of cog in a series of wheels. So, I mean, I think it's important to remember that sometimes, that what we're comparing algorithms with is not so lovely.
I agree with her, and also, you know, I think there's a big, the question you raised about the different levels of accountability, transparency, legitimacy we are exposed to right now. The world has changed from the way it used to be before. As I said, this is a discussion that is very relevant to other communities as well, and if we had open government people in the room, the whole perspective they would have would be really, really very strong when it comes to the transparency. So this to say that because of the openness, the inclusiveness, the engagement, and the openness, I think in societies, I think the discussion needs to be multifaceted, and I think, yeah, things are changing in terms also of the level of requests, in terms of accountability and transparency, legitimacy that is coming from the public, and we need to take that into account and make decisions on where we need to set the limits and how we formulate whatever comes out as a result of using an algorithm, either you should or we recommend you do it.
Great. So I'm afraid we have to stop here. Sorry. It has been basically, first of all, thanks to the panelists. Thank you, everyone, for basically staying until this time, until the end of the conference. It has been really great pleasure to host you, and I hope that we'll stay in touch. Just before we close, I just want to thank a few people and organizations. So first, basically, our team, Nathaniel, Servet at the back, Lisa, and our UCL and ONS team, volunteers, they have been really great. I mean, they have done so. I think if you join me with an applause for them first. Yeah, and the other thing is obviously Government Office for Science and ONS, again, so generously basically provided the venue and all the facilities to us, so thank you to them as well. Thank you to our UCL video production team. They have been working throughout over the 2 days as well. And finally, thank you again to all our panelists.